The Pacific came in hard that morning. Waves broke against Coronado Beach like something that hadn't slept, like something that had been moving toward this particular shore for 1,000 miles and had arrived with unfinished business. The sky was the color of an old bruise, purple bleeding into gray, bleeding into the first thin line of orange at the horizon. It was 4:52 in the morning, and the sand was cold and wet, and the air tasted like salt, and the kind of cold that gets into the lungs and stays there. 46 men stood at the waterline. They were not ordinary men. Every one of them had already passed tests that break most people. Every one of them had survived screening processes designed to find the edges of human endurance and push hard against them. They were Navy candidates, the best the recruiting pipeline had produced that cycle. Big shoulders, thick necks, the kind of physical presence that fills a room without trying and empties it when things get serious. They stood in formation and stared at the water and said nothing. Then Master Chief Dale Harp walked the line. He was 52 years old and looked like something carved rather than born. 2 decades with SEAL Team 2 had left their marks on him. A scar along his left jaw, knuckles that had never quite healed straight, eyes that moved constantly and rested nowhere. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. When Harp spoke, men listened the way they listen to thunder, not because it's asking them to, but because something in the chest responds before the mind decides to. He reached the end of the line. He stopped. He looked at what was standing there, 5 feet, 3 inches, 130 pounds, dark hair pulled back tight against her skull, jaw set like a closed door, eyes the color of deep water, not the deep water you swim in, but the deep water below that, the kind that has no bottom you can see from any surface. 46 men turned their heads. Nobody said anything, but the silence had a texture to it. You could feel it pressing against your skin. Harp looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at his clipboard. Then he looked at her again. She didn't move. She didn't explain herself. She just stood there, at the end of the line, in exactly the position she was supposed to be in, as if the question of whether she belonged there had already been settled somewhere else, and she hadn't bothered to bring it with her. Her name was Riley Voss, and nobody on that beach had any idea what was about to happen. Pull back 3 days. Montana in October is not gentle. The sky comes down low, and the mountains go up hard, and everything in between is wind and silence and the smell of pine and cold water. The lake at the bottom of the valley is called Flathead, and it is wide and still and dark, and on the eastern bank, set back into the tree line far enough that you wouldn't find it unless you knew where to look, there was a cabin. Small, old, maintained with the kind of care that says, I don't need much, but what I have, I keep. Riley Voss was awake at 4:28 in the morning, 2 minutes before her alarm. She hadn't needed the alarm in 3 years. Her body had simply decided this was when the day started, and her body was not the kind of thing that argued with itself once it had made a decision. She ran 8 miles before the sun came up. Not jogging, running, the kind of pace that eats distance without ceremony, arms tight, breath controlled, feet finding the frozen ground and leaving it again in the same motion, over and over, for 47 minutes through the dark. She ran the same trail every morning, up through the tree line, out along the ridge, down the back slope, around the eastern edge of the lake, home. She knew every route, every rock, every place where the ground went soft near the water. She knew them the way you know things that have kept you from falling. Back at the cabin, she did not rest. 200 push-ups, 150 pull-ups on the bar mounted in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen. Sit-ups until her stomach stopped burning and started simply working, the way an engine works past the point of complaint and into something mechanical and reliable and indifferent to how it feels. Then she went to the range she had built behind the cabin, 40 yards into the tree line. 5 positions at varying distances marked by steel plates, the closest at 100 yards, the farthest at 420. The plates had been hit so many times they developed a particular ring when struck, a specific note, like a tuning fork that only she knew the pitch of. She shot the Remington 700 that morning. It was not a new rifle. The stock had been refinished twice. The barrel had been replaced once. But the trigger had never been touched by anyone except the man who had set it, years ago, with hands that were steadier than most surgeons develop in a lifetime of practice. The break was at exactly 2 pounds, 2 ounces. Clean, consistent, like a thought completing itself before you finish thinking it. She fired 12 rounds, 12 hits. She tracked them not by sound, though she heard every one, but by the adjustments between shots. The small corrections she made the way you adjust a conversation when you're actually listening, leaning into what the rifle was telling her about the wind and the cold and the angle of the early light through the trees. Her father had taught her to listen to the rifle. Back inside, she made coffee and stood at the window that faced the lake and drank it while the sky moved from black to gray to the specific pale gold that meant the sun was finally committing to the day. On the wall beside the window there was one photograph, just one. A man in desert camouflage, big across the chest, with a smile that belonged to someone who hadn't quite decided whether the world was funny or simply relentless. He was holding a child, a small girl, maybe 4 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes. The girl had her head tilted slightly to the side, watching the camera the way children watch things they haven't categorized yet. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that Riley had memorized before she could fully read, "Teach her everything. Spectre, 2002. His name was Frank Voss. His call sign was Spectre. He had been a chief petty officer with SEAL Team 6, which is not something you become by accident or by wanting it badly enough. You become it because you are built a certain way, and then you choose to find out exactly how far that building goes. And then you choose again, after every test removes another layer of everyone else, until what remains is the thing that was there at the core all along. Frank Voss had been that thing. He had deployed 8 times in 12 years. He had come home from 7 of them. In March of 2003, Riley was 5 years old. He went to Afghanistan as part of a classified special operations package in the months following Operation Anaconda. The official record said almost nothing about what happened after that. Official records rarely do for men like Spectre Voss. He did not come home. Riley grew up knowing the shape of his absence better than she knew his face. She knew the way his handwriting leaned slightly right. She knew the smell of the gun oil he used because she still used it. She knew the trigger he had set because her finger had learned its weight before she was old enough to understand what she was learning. She knew almost nothing else. And for 21 years, that had been enough to keep her moving. That morning, standing at the window with her coffee, her phone rang. Commander Boyd Whitaker. She answered on the second ring. Whitaker's voice was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where good news was a liability. Measured, deliberate, the kind of voice that chose its words the way a sniper chooses a position, for stability, for the clean line to the target, for what it costs you if you're wrong. He told her about the program, Department of Defense, congressional mandate, a pilot assessment. One female candidate observed integration into BUD/S selection, evaluated for operational feasibility. Not a gift, not a gesture. A test designed with margins narrow enough to fail most people who tried. Riley listened without speaking. Whitaker said, "Your father spent 3 years trying to get this door open. He believed it mattered. He wrote reports. He made arguments through proper channels and then through improper ones. He pushed until pushing became a problem for the people above him. He said, someone made sure that door stayed shut. He said, and then someone made sure your father couldn't keep pushing." Riley set down her coffee cup. She looked at the photograph, the man with the smile, the small girl with the serious eyes. She said, "When do I report?" Whitaker gave her the date, the location, the reporting instructions. Then he said one more thing, The thing that stayed with her through the 18-hour drive south, through Nevada and into California, through the desert heat and the long roads that went nowhere interesting. He said, "I'm not coming with you. This one is yours." She understood what he meant. She drove south. The gate at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado opened at 0547, and Riley drove through it in a truck with 200,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield she had never bothered to fix because it wasn't in her sightline. She checked in, was assigned a bunk, and was told to report to the Bud/S assessment building at 0630. She was there at 0615. She sat in the plastic chair in the waiting room and looked at the other candidates, 46 of them at various points of pre-mission stillness, some reading, some with their eyes closed, some doing the thing men do before difficult things begin, which is to look at nothing and think about everything. Nobody looked at her directly. They looked near her, the way you look near a light source when you're not yet sure what category it belongs to. At 0628, the door opened. Master Chief Dale Harp walked in and occupied the room. His scan swept the space in a single pass and stopped when it reached Riley. He looked at his clipboard. He looked back at her. He walked across the room with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man executing a decision he has already made. He stopped in front of her. He said, "Miss Voss, this is BUD/S selection. This is not a field trip. This is not a program that has room for anyone who is here for any reason other than to find out if they can meet a standard that has broken better candidates than you will ever be." He said it without cruelty. That was the thing about Harp. The absence of cruelty made it worse, because you couldn't dismiss it as anger. It was professional assessment, delivered with the flat precision of someone who has said difficult things so many times that they no longer require emotion to carry them. He said, "Get lost." Riley reached into her jacket. She produced a folded document, Department of Defense letterhead. The signature at the bottom belonged to the Deputy Undersecretary of Naval Operations, and the seal was the kind that people in Harp's position recognize the way civilians recognize a red light, not because they think about it, but because the response has been trained into them at a level below conscious decision. Harp took the document. He read it. He read it again. He folded it and handed it back. The room had gone completely quiet. 46 men who had been pretending not to watch were no longer pretending. Something shifted in Harp's expression. Not warmth, not anything that soft. Something more like recalibration. The adjustment a precision instrument makes when the parameters of the problem change. He said, "You fall behind, you're out. You get hurt, you're out. You quit, you're out. I don't apologize. I don't make accommodations. You are evaluated on the same standard as every other candidate in this room. Not modified, not adjusted. The same standard." He said, "Are we clear?" Riley said, "Hoo-yah, Master Chief." The room stayed quiet for 3 more seconds. Then Harp turned and the assessment began, and 46 men went back to looking straight ahead. But something had changed in the quality of the silence. The man sitting closest to Riley, a candidate named Petty Officer Trent Hollis, who had the build of someone raised on hard work and the habit of going completely still when things got loud around him, looked at her once from the side. He said nothing, but he looked. The water temperature in the Pacific off Coronado that morning was 56 degrees. The 500-yard assessment swim was the first physical evaluation. Standard stroke, standard course, time limit 12 minutes and 30 seconds. A number that sounds manageable until you are in 56-degree water and your body begins making resource allocation decisions that override whatever your mind is trying to tell it. Riley entered the water without ceremony. She swam the way she ran, not for spectacle, not for anyone watching, but with the economy of someone who has done this 10,000 times in conditions that were often worse. Her stroke was not flashy. It was functional. It was the stroke of someone who learned from a man who believed that everything genuinely useful is quiet. She finished in 11 minutes and 47 seconds. She climbed out. She didn't look at the clock. She walked back to the staging area, wrung the water from her hair, and waited for the next evolution. That evening, after candidates were released to quarters, Master Chief Harp sat in his office with a file folder open in front of him. The file had come with Riley's candidate package, flagged in a way that required secondary clearance to access. He had pulled that clearance that afternoon. The name on the secondary file was R. Hartwell. The photographs matched. The record showed completion of a Ranger assessment package under observation, unofficial capacity, the kind of evaluation that happens when certain people want to know something without creating a paper trail that uses the subject's real name. The data was clinical. 847-yard shot, crosswind at 18 miles per hour, moving target, ambient temperature 41 degrees. 5 rounds, 5 hits. Accuracy rating 97.3%. At the bottom, a single handwritten note from the evaluating officer. Do not lose track of this one. Harp closed the file. He sat for a while and looked at the wall. Then he picked up his coffee and finished it and went back to work. Because complicated situations required clear heads, and the situation had just become considerably more complicated than it had been this morning. Outside, Riley Voss was lying on her bunk in the dark, not sleeping. She was thinking about a name she had been carrying for 3 days since Whitaker's call. A name that connected a closed door to an open grave. Rear Admiral Gerald Stokes had appeared on the observation deck that afternoon. She had noticed him the moment he stepped into view. The way she noticed everything that moved into her field of awareness. Not dramatically, not with alarm, but with the quiet, ongoing attention of someone who understood that information collected before you need it is the only kind that reliably saves you. He had watched the evolutions for 40 minutes. He had watched her for 23 of those minutes specifically. When the drown-proofing supplement appeared on the afternoon schedule, in addition, not on the original program, an unannounced evaluation with her name at the top of the roster, she understood she was not simply being tested by the institution. She was being tested by a specific person, for specific reasons that had nothing to do with BUD/S. Hollis had leaned over during staging and said, quietly, without looking at her, "Someone upstairs wants you gone today." She had nodded once. Then she had walked to the edge of the pool and found her breath, found the rhythm her father had given her, found the thing underneath the noise that doesn't change regardless of what's happening on the surface. And she had jumped. 9 feet of dark water closed over her head. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her ankles were tied. The cold came through like something deliberate, something that wanted her to understand exactly how small she was in relation to it. She found the bottom. She pushed off. She rose. She breathed. 4 minutes. 5 minutes. She rose and breathed and sank and rose and breathed. And the rhythm became its own thing, steady and self-sustaining. And the water that had been a threat became simply a medium she was moving through. And the time passed the way difficult time passes when you have found the center of yourself and decided to stay there. She climbed out after 5 minutes and 12 seconds. The pool deck was quiet. Stokes had already turned and walked toward the exit before she reached the ladder. She didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. That night, she reached under her mattress and removed the envelope she had carried from Montana. Sealed since the day a JAG officer handed it to her mother in 2003, when Riley was 5 years old. Her mother had given it to her on her 18th birthday without opening it. Riley had carried it for 8 years without opening it. She opened it now. Inside, a single folded sheet, handwritten on both sides. At the top, March 2003. At the bottom, F. Voss, Spectre. Between them, a list of 12 names. At the bottom of the list, in smaller letters, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back. These men know what happened. Find them. Start with the second name. He's the one who can open the door or close it for good." She looked at the second name, Gerald R. Stokes. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope, and lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling. Across the base, the light in Stokes's office was still on. Outside, the Pacific kept coming in, wave after wave after wave. Not cruel, not kind, just continuous. Just the long, patient work of water against land, wearing down whatever stands in front of it, one wave at a time, until the thing that seemed permanent is simply gone. Riley Voss closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the real work began. Hour 30 of Hell Week, and the world had reduced itself to something very simple. There was the cold. There was the sand. There was the next evolution, and the one after that. And somewhere past the point where most minds start negotiating with themselves about what is truly necessary and what can reasonably be let go, there was whatever came after that. The Pacific was running at 54 degrees. It had been running at 54 degrees for 3 days, and 3 days of 54-degree water does something to a body that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't been inside it. It isn't just cold. Cold is a sensation, something that comes and goes. What happens after sustained immersion at that temperature is a conversation. A long, one-sided conversation between the water and every system in your body, each responding in its own way, at its own pace, and none of them responding the way you want them to. Boat Crew 4 had been together for 62 hours. There were 6 of them. Petty Officer Trent Hollis, who had the build of someone raised on physical work and the habit of going completely still when things got loud around him. The stillness of a man who had learned that noise is almost never the thing itself, just the thing announcing itself. A candidate named Brecker from Ohio, who had been a high school wrestler and possessed the kind of physical stubbornness that develops from years of being in positions you cannot escape through anything except outlasting them. 2 others, Farrell and Pogue, who had found something in each other in the first 12 hours that functioned like friendship, or at least the version of friendship that forms when people are suffering in the same direction. And Riley Voss, who had not complained once, not once, not during the log PT, when the telephone pole they were carrying, 310 pounds of waterlogged Douglas fir, had shifted on the uphill section and redistributed its weight onto her left shoulder in a way that would leave a bruise the size of a dinner plate. Not during the surf torture, when they lay in the shallows with the waves breaking over them, the instructors walking the line and offering nothing encouraging. Not during the paddle evolutions, when the inflatable boat took on water in a cross-chop and the crew kept paddling regardless, arms past the point of burning and into something that doesn't have a name because the people who felt it are generally too tired to invent one. She had not complained. She had also not tried to inspire anyone. No speeches. None of the aggressive encouragement that sometimes comes from people trying to lead and sometimes comes from people trying to distract themselves from their own pain by redirecting attention towards someone else's. She had simply kept going, at the pace required, with the form required, present at the front of every evolution when it started, and at the finish when it ended. By hour 30, Boat Crew 4 had stopped being annoyed by her presence. They hadn't decided she belonged. That wasn't the same thing. But the low-grade resistance of the first day and a half, the sideways looks, the near inaudible comments, the way Hollis had positioned himself during the first log carry so the weight fell more heavily on her side, all of it had gone quiet, the way noise goes quiet when something louder happens. What happened louder was hour 30. They were on the beach in the dark, waiting for the next evolution to be called. The instructors had stepped back for a rotation change. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Around them, the other boat crews were in various states of managed collapse. Men with their arms on their knees and their heads down. Men flat on the sand, staring at the sky. Men doing the internal work of hour 30, which is a negotiation between the part of you that knows why you're here and the part that has spent 60 hours developing a very persuasive counterargument. Hollis was sitting 2 feet to Riley's left, hands hanging between his knees, breathing shallow and controlled. the breathing of someone carefully managing a resource that is running low. Then he heard it, very soft, not performed, not aimed at anyone. The kind of sound that comes out because something inside has decided it needs to, regardless of the audience. Riley Voss was humming. The melody was slow and deliberate, with a gravity to it, the kind of melody written to carry weight without breaking. It moved through the cold air without asking anything of anyone who heard it. Hollis turned his head. He said, "What is that?" She let the phrase complete before she answered. Then she said, "Navy hymn, Eternal Father, strong to save." He said, "Why now?" She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of finding an answer, but the quiet of deciding how much of the true answer to give. She said, "My dad used to hum it when things got bad. I was 4 years old. I didn't understand the words. I didn't know where it came from. I just knew that when I heard it, he was still going. And if he was still going, we were all right." Hollis said nothing. Then after a moment, he started to hum it himself, badly, off-key, with the self-conscious stiffness of a man who has never considered himself someone who hums. But he hummed it. Brecker picked it up next, then Farrell, then Pogue. 5 voices in the dark, on a cold beach, in hour 30 of a process designed to locate the exact outer edge of what a person can sustain. The sound was imperfect and ragged at the edges, and would not have moved anyone in ordinary circumstances. In these circumstances, it sounded like something that mattered. Master Chief Dale Harp was standing 40 yards down the beach, going over the next evolution schedule with a junior instructor. He heard the sound and turned toward it the way you turn towards something that sits slightly outside your expectations, which is the only direction anything genuinely interesting ever comes from. He listened for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he turned back to his clipboard. He said nothing. He wrote nothing down. But the junior instructor watching his face noticed something shift in his expression. Small, almost imperceptible, the way a door that has been closed for a long time moves a quarter inch in a direction that might mean it is no longer locked. Harp went back to work, but he had heard it. On the 6th day, Riley woke at 4:15. She had slept 4 hours, more than she'd managed in the previous 48 combined, and her body had taken it with the focused gratitude of a system that had been running on depleted reserves and knew exactly what to do with the fuel when it finally arrived. She lay still for 60 seconds and ran an inventory. Left shoulder, functional, bruised from the log shift, range of motion reduced but not compromised. Both hands, blistered at the paddle grip points, wrapped, holding. Lower back, talking, not shouting, a distinction that mattered. Everything else, present, operational, making no demands she couldn't meet. She dressed in the dark and went to the range. The marksmanship evaluation was scheduled for 0800. She spent an hour at the standard issue M16 range, working dry fire drills, reacquainting her hands with a platform that wasn't the Remington, not her rifle, not the rifle her father had tuned, just a standard tool with standard tolerances she needed to perform with anyway. She drilled until the unfamiliar became familiar, which is the only way it ever becomes that. At 0800, she reported, the qualification shoot was not designed to find snipers. 5 rounds, targets at 250 yards, scored on a 10-ring paper target. It was designed to confirm basic competency, nothing more. Riley shot it with her Remington 700. She had received no instruction to use a different rifle. The qualification sheet specified caliber range and safety compliance. Her Remington met both. She confirmed 0 with 2 fouling shots at 100 yards and then shot the course. 5 rounds, 5 10s. The scoring instructor looked at the target through his spotting scope for a moment longer than the situation required. Then he marked the score sheet. Rear Admiral Gerald Stokes was not present for the morning shoot. He arrived at 11:30 with 2 aides and went directly to the range office where the results were filed. He spent 11 minutes inside. Then he came out and spoke briefly with the range safety officer, Lieutenant Commander Peabody, a man who now carried the specific expression of someone who has been handed something he didn't ask for and told to deliver it regardless of how it sits with him. At 13:45, Riley was informed that her qualification chute was under administrative review due to a reported equipment irregularity with her rifle, and that she would be required to reshoot the course that afternoon on a standard issue platform. Hollis found her in the staging area 15 minutes before the reshoot. He looked at her and then looked at the range and then said, quietly, "Peabody looked like a man carrying something that wasn't his to carry." She said, "I know." He said, "Reshoot is at 600 yards, not 250. Wind shifted an hour ago, coming off the water now, 12 to 14 knots and not steady." Before he walked away, he pressed something small into her palm, an earpiece, low profile, the kind that disappears inside the ear canal. He said, "In case things move faster than they're supposed to." She closed her hand around it and said nothing. The M24 SWS the Armory issued her was a capable rifle. Leupold M3A 10x scope, Remington 700 action. Same action as her personal rifle, which was either irony or small mercy, depending on your disposition. But the trigger was different. The stock geometry was different. The balance point was different. At distance, in a crosswind, after 5 days of physical attrition, different is not a small variable. She lay prone behind the M24 and did not rush. The wind was gusting in an irregular pattern. 7 seconds of consistent flow, then a 3 to 4 second lull, then back up. She spent the first minute watching the grass at the target berm. Just watching, cataloging the rhythm. Her father's voice, in the part of memory that is bone deep and nonverbal. The wind doesn't lie. It tells you exactly what it's doing if you're willing to watch long enough. She watched. 11 seconds. The wind dropped to its low. She fired. The round struck 2 inches left of center. Not a 10. She noted the correction, adjusted, and waited for the next lull without frustration, without hurry, with the patience of someone who understands that the range does not owe you favorable conditions and has never pretended otherwise. The next lull came 8 seconds later. She fired. 10. 3 more rounds. 3 more 10s. She stood, cleared the rifle, and handed it back to the armorer without looking at the target. She had felt every shot break the way it needed to break. Through the range office window, she could see Stokes standing very still. He did not look at her. He turned and walked away before she reached the staging area. She watched him go and said nothing, and filed the information in the ongoing inventory of a person who has been taught that what you notice before you need it is the only preparation that never fails you. That night she woke at 02:17. The bunk room was quiet. Brecker was snoring lightly 3 bunks down. Ventilation hummed. Outside, the base moved through its night rhythms. Vehicles, voices, the continuous machinery of an institution that does not sleep. She lay still and listened. Then she heard it, very quiet. The specific sound of a phone keypad under careful pressure. Someone texting in the dark, trying not to make noise, in the bunk 2 positions from hers. She lay still for 4 more minutes. The sound came twice more, short exchanges. Then silence. She got up. Trent Hollis was sitting on the edge of his bunk with his phone face down on his knee. When he heard her moving, he went completely still. Not the stillness of sleep, not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of someone who has been found at something and is deciding in real time what comes next. She sat down across from him. The base light coming through the blinds cut the room into thin, alternating strips of dark and darker. She said, "Who are you talking to?" He was quiet. She said, "I'm not asking for drama. I need to understand what's happening around me. That's not a small thing at this point." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the phone down. He said, "Commander Whitaker." He said, He reached out 6 weeks ago, before this assessment started. He told me you'd be here. He told me Stokes would be watching you, and that Stokes had leverage and history and the kind of motivation that doesn't resolve on its own. He asked me to watch the edges of things and report if it looked like it was becoming something beyond professional obstruction. She said, "You've been reporting to him." He said, "Twice a day." She said, "And tonight?" He said, "Tonight I told him about the rifle pull and the reshoot conditions. He wanted to know if it was escalating." She said, "What did he say?" Hollis reached into the chest pocket of his shirt and removed something small and held it out across the space between the bunks. A dog tag. She took it. In the thin light she read the stamp. Voss, Frank A., USN, SEAL Team 6, blood type, religion. The small rectangle of metal a man carries so that if the field wins, the people who find him will know who he was. She held it in her palm. Hollis said, "Whitaker said to give it to you when the time felt right. Your father gave it to him the last time they saw each other. March 2003. Said he wasn't sure what was coming and wanted someone he trusted to hold it safe." The room was very quiet. Riley ran her thumb over the stamped letters. She thought about a man in desert camouflage holding a small girl who was watching the camera with serious eyes. She thought about a trigger set at 2 pounds, 2 ounces. She thought about Navy him moving through cold air on a dark beach. She thought about a list of 12 names and the instruction to start with the second one. She closed her hand around the dog tag. She said, "Thank you." She went back to her bunk and did not sleep again. The 8th night was a Tuesday. The duty roster showed minimum staffing in the administrative complex from 0100 to 0345. Skeleton crew, 1 duty officer, 1 security rotation covering main access points every 14 minutes on a pattern she had confirmed over 3 days of careful observation. The side entrance through the maintenance corridor adjacent to the HVAC systems accepted her candidate access credential. She went at 0130. The corridor smelled like motor oil and recycled air. She moved without a light, counting steps from the entry point to the interior door, navigating from the map she had built during daylight hours when she had walked this part of the building on legitimate business. Interior door, service hallway, administrative wing, 2nd floor. She found the safe behind the framed photograph of the USS Nimitz. Stokes struck her as a man who trusted physical locks the way men of his generation trusted institutions, not because they hadn't seen either one fail, but because the alternative to trust was a vigilance that never rested, and nobody can sustain that indefinitely. The safe was a Gardall MS-911, mechanical combination, 3-wheel lock. Her father had shown her a Gardall at the cabin when she was 7 years old. He had placed her small hands on the dial and guided them through the sequence, explaining the feel of each wheel as it engaged, the way the mechanism communicates through your fingertips if you are paying the right kind of attention. She stood at the safe and paid that attention. 90 seconds. It opened. Inside, 3 folders, a USB drive, a personal sidearm, and a sealed envelope addressed in Stokes' handwriting to an attorney in Washington. She photographed the attorney's name and turned to the folders. The second folder carried a classification stamp across its cover. She opened it. Operation Ridgeback, Afghanistan Theater, March through July 2003. She read slowly, the way you read things you have been moving toward for a long time, things that are going to change the shape of what you understand, things that cannot be unread. The operation had been a classified direct action package following Operation Anaconda. Spectre Voss had been assigned as team chief on a 4-man element in the Kunar province. On March 14, 2003, a secondary target was added to the mission matrix. The authorization came not through standard Joint Special Operations Command architecture, but through a parallel channel, a separate directive signed by Rear Admiral Gerald Stokes, operating under a program whose name was redacted throughout the document. The secondary target was identified only by a reference number. Spectre Voss had identified this man 24 hours before the engagement window. His after-action notes were precise and controlled, written in the flat, professional language of someone who reports facts without coloring them. He wrote, "The designated target is engaged in active negotiations with ICRC representatives regarding prisoner exchange protocols. Engagement of this target at this time would constitute the killing of a civilian intermediary in the middle of a humanitarian process. I am requesting authorization withdrawal and mission parameter review before proceeding." The withdrawal was denied not by the standard command chain, denied by the same parallel directive that had originated the target. Spectre Voss's final note, dated March 16, 2003, "I will not execute this order. My team and I are proceeding to extract our assets. If anyone comes with us on that, they're coming on their own decision. I won't order them into it." The next entry was not written by Frank Voss. It was a casualty notation. Date, March 17, 2003. Time, 0312 local. A name, a rank. A 4-digit grid coordinate in the Kunar province. Cause of death, hostile contact during unsanctioned movement outside mission parameters. The name was Voss, Frank A., Chief Petty Officer. She read that line twice. She stood in the dark office for a long time. The building was quiet around her. Outside, the base moved through its night rhythms, indifferent to what was being understood in this room. She did not fall apart. That was not available to her right now, and she knew it. And she had learned, from the man who had set her trigger and hummed through bad moments and written "teach her everything" on the back of a photograph, that falling apart belongs to the time after the work is done, not before it, not during it. She photographed every page. She closed the safe. She restored the photograph. She left through the maintenance corridor and crossed the dark base and lay down on her bunk and held her father's dog tag in her right hand. She breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm he had given her before she had words for what it was. The rhythm she had carried every day of the 21 years since he hadn't come back. In, out, still going. In the morning, there was a notice on the candidate board. The chair assessment, final evaluation, outdoor marksmanship complex, main observation facility, 0900. Senior evaluation board in attendance. Her name was at the top of the qualified candidate list. She read the notice once. She went to the mess for coffee. At 0812, coming out of the mess building, her phone vibrated. One message from Whitaker. No greeting, no context. Confirmed threat at the venue. Real target, real shooter, real timeline. Not part of the exercise. Trust what you know. She read it, deleted it, put the phone in her pocket, and walked toward the marksmanship complex in the thin California morning light. The dog tag warm against her chest, her boots finding the pavement without ceremony. One step, and then the next, and then the one after that, all the way to wherever this was going to end. The marksmanship complex at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was built for utility. Concrete shooting positions in a long covered line, steel target frames at graduated distances, the farthest barely visible on a clear day, and disappearing into coastal haze on mornings like this one. A wooden observation platform elevated 12 feet above the range floor, fitted with a long table, folding chairs, and a microphone arrangement that said, "What happens here today is intended to be formal, or to carry the appearance of formality," which in institutions is often the same thing. The wind was coming off the Pacific at 12 knots, running that direction since before dawn, consistent and salt-heavy, the kind of wind that doesn't announce itself but simply is there, a constant variable to be incorporated into every calculation, not with alarm, but with the steady, matter-of-fact precision of someone who accounts for what is actually present rather than what would be more convenient. Riley arrived at 0823, 37 minutes early. She walked the space, not in a way that drew attention, just the easy movement of someone orienting herself, getting familiar with the geometry, the sight lines, the angles of the low eastern light on the range surfaces. She noted the positions of the support personnel. She noted where the evaluation board's administrative staff was setting up. She noted where the shadows fell and where they didn't. The senior evaluation board arrived at 0831, 7 people in mixed uniform and civilian dress, moving up the steps to the observation platform with the purposeful unhaste of people accustomed to being the reason things begin. She placed 2 of them from Whitaker's briefing materials. The others she cataloged and held. Then she saw Rear Admiral Gerald Stokes. He came up the steps last and moved to the far left end of the table, where a chair had been positioned slightly apart from the others, slightly back. The position of a man who wants to see without being visibly seen, watching. He placed both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at the range. He did not look at Riley. She watched him not looking at her for 4 seconds. Then she turned back to the range and continued her orientation. At 0843, she saw the thing that didn't fit. It was small. The kind of detail that only resolves into meaning if your eye has been trained to find discrepancies in the distribution of people in space. If you have spent years understanding that the gap between where someone is and where they are supposed to be is sometimes the most important measurement available to you. A man in maintenance coveralls standing near the northeastern corner of the facility. Maintenance personnel were part of the visual texture of the base, unremarkable, absorbed into the background the same way the seagulls were absorbed. This man was standing slightly wrong, not dramatically wrong, not in a way that would register as significant to someone without the specific vocabulary for it. He was oriented toward the observation platform. His hands were in his pockets, which working maintenance personnel don't do because working hands need to be free. He had been in the same position for the 11 minutes Riley had been on the range. 11 minutes longer than someone with an actual task would stand still. She looked from him to the observation platform. She located Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Raymond Patterson in the second chair from the right, where the administrative staff had placed him with the small, deliberate attention that signals someone has thought about positioning. Patterson was 61 years old, 4 administrations of consequential service, the kind of man who had stopped calculating his own significance somewhere along the way because it had long since stopped being in question. She measured the angle from the northeastern corner to Patterson's position. 340 yards. The corner was sheltered from the main wind flow by the range's concrete infrastructure, which meant the shooter there would be working in considerably calmer air than the posted crosswind suggested. The conditions at that position were favorable. The sight line was direct and clean. She did not alter her expression. She finished her walk of the space, went to her assigned staging position, opened her rifle case, and began her pre-shoot preparation in the specific order her father had taught her. Each step completed fully before the next one began. At 0857, Hollis materialized beside her. He looked at the range, then he said, in the flat, quiet register of someone ensuring his words carry no farther than they need to, "Northeast corner, maintenance coveralls." She said, "I see him." He said, "Whitaker's contact at base security pulled a threat fragment from a monitoring channel 40 minutes ago. Possible hostile element, possible target in the evaluation board. Timeline is compressed." She said, "How compressed?" He said, "They think his window opens when the formal proceedings begin. Range is hot, ambient noise provides cover, board is seated and stationary. He's been patient enough to wait for ideal conditions." She said, "Patterson, not a question." Hollis said, "That's the assessment." She said, "Where is the intercept team?" He said, "Moving carefully. They don't want to trigger a panic on an active range with senior officials present. Quiet intercept takes 14 minutes minimum from current position." She looked at the northeastern corner. She said, "He doesn't have 14 minutes." Hollis said, Formal proceedings start in 3 minutes. Once they start, Patterson is seated and stationary, and that corner is exactly where you'd want to be. She said, "Get Patterson out of the direct sight line. Move his chair back 2 feet, angle it toward the center of the table. Make it look like a comfort adjustment. Do it before the proceedings begin." Hollis said, "And you?" She looked at the rifle on the bench. She looked at the northeastern corner. She looked at the observation platform, at the chair where Stokes sat with his hands flat, at the formality of the whole arrangement, at the weight of institutional process that was supposed to govern what happened here today. She said, "I'm going to finish what I came here to do." Hollis moved. She watched him go up the platform steps and approach one of the administrative staff with the easy, purposeful manner of someone executing a routine task. She watched the chair adjusted. She watched Patterson shift position without looking up from his briefing document. She closed the rifle case and carried it to her assigned shooting position and set up. The formal proceedings began at 09:01, 2 minutes behind schedule. Assessment Coordination Officer Commander Greer read the parameters from a prepared statement. 5 candidates, final assessment, 3 targets at graduated distances, 600 yards, 750 yards, 900 yards. 8 minutes per candidate, standard 10-ring scoring, perfect score, 30 points. The first candidate, Reyes, had finished every previous evolution in the top 3. He shot clean and efficient, the way someone performs who has prepared well and managed the pressure competently. 26 out of 30. Second candidate, 23. Third, 25, with 1 imperfect cluster on the 900-yard target. The wind had cooperated for the others, and then declined to cooperate for him, which is the range's prerogative and always has been. Fourth, 24. Riley was called last. She had spent the preceding 4 shoots sitting in the staging area with her hands resting on her knees and her eyes on the target frames downrange, watching the grass at the berms, watching the wind indicators, cataloging the pattern of the coastal air as it moved through the range environment. She had 40 minutes of observation time that the previous candidates had not had. She had used every minute of it. She walked to the shooting position. She set up the Remington 700 on the bipod and settled into the prone position, making the small adjustments that brought her into alignment with the stock. Cheek weld, eye relief, the geometry of a person, and a rifle finding the configuration in which they work together. She placed her finger outside the trigger guard and looked through the scope at the 600-yard target. On the observation platform, the board watched. She breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm her father had given her. The rhythm that had carried her through 54-degree water and 30 hours without sleep, and 5 days of physical attrition, and a classified file read in a dark office at 0200 in the morning. The rhythm that was not calm. Calm is the absence of something, and this was the presence of something. A deep centering, a settling of all the systems of a person into alignment around a single purpose. She said, aloud, in a voice quiet enough for the range microphone to capture, but not loud enough to carry to the platform, "Elevation plus 2.8, wind 9, left to right, consistent." She paused. She said, "Breathing." She said, "Now." She fired. The 600-yard plate rang. Clean, high register, a center hit. She cycled the bolt without rushing, settled back into position, looked through the scope at the 750 marker. The wind shifted. Not dramatically, 3 to 4 knots of added velocity, the direction holding but the pressure increasing, which changed the lateral drift calculation by approximately 1.5 inches at 750 yards. She watched the berm grass. She measured the shift against the pattern she had been observing for 40 minutes. She said, "Wind 14, adjusting right, 0.4. She waited 8 seconds. The wind dropped back. She said, "Breathing." She said, "Now." The 750 plate rang. On the observation platform, a board member leaned forward. She heard the distant sound of a chair moving. She did not look up. She cycled the bolt, settled into the 900-yard position, and let the world reduce itself to the small circle of the scope, and the distant target, and the wind, and the trigger under her finger. She said, elevation plus 4.1, wind variable, reading the low. She did not fire immediately. 11 seconds passed. She heard the low murmur of someone on the platform saying something to someone else. She did not process the words. They were outside the perimeter of what she was doing. She said, breathing, 4 seconds. She said, now. The 900-yard plate rang. She cleared the rifle and stood up, back straight, hands at her sides, looking downrange at the 3 targets. 30 out of 30, perfect score. The range was quiet in the way it goes quiet when something significant has just occurred. Not the silence of nothing, but the silence of a space processing what it has witnessed. She heard Harp's voice somewhere behind her, saying something to someone in a tone she couldn't read. She heard the board above recalibrating, papers, chairs, the muffled exchange of people whose expectations have just been revised. She did not look at the observation platform. She began breaking down her rifle. It was 0919. The man in maintenance coveralls had not moved, still in the slightly wrong position, still facing the angle that gave him what he needed. She had clocked 11 minutes since Hollis had moved Patterson's chair. The intercept team was theoretically in position. Theoretically. The formal proceedings were still active. Patterson was still on the platform, at a better angle now, but still within the envelope of what a capable shooter at 340 yards could manage with favorable conditions on his side. She looked at the northeastern corner. She looked at her rifle, half disassembled on the bench. She reassembled it in 47 seconds and loaded a single round. She said quietly to the empty air in front of her, Hollis. His voice came back through the earpiece. Here, she said, where is the intercept team? He said, 90 seconds out, maybe 2 minutes. They hit a delay at the secondary access. She said, he's going to move before that. The board is still in session and Patterson is still visible, and he knows his window closes when the proceedings end. Hollis was quiet for 2 seconds. He said, Riley. She said, I know. She moved back to the shooting position and settled into the prone. She set the bipod at the correct elevation for the northeastern corner, lower than the range targets, angled back across the facility in a way the range was not designed for, shooting across the wind pattern rather than into it with the lateral correction reversed from everything her body had been calibrated for in the past 40 minutes. She looked through the scope. The man in maintenance coveralls had shifted. He was no longer standing with his hands in his pockets. His right hand was at his side, and there was something in that hand that she could see at 340 yards through a 5.522 by 56 scope with sufficient clarity to leave no uncertainty about what it was or what he intended to do with it. She breathed, in through the nose, the cold salt air in the morning, her father's voice, not a memory exactly, more like a frequency that lives in the part of you that learned things before you had language for learning them. Find the center, not the center of the target, the center of yourself. Everything else follows from there. She found it. She said quietly, elevation minus 1.6, wind reversed, correcting left, range 340. She settled. She said, breathing. 3 seconds between the third and fourth beat of her own heart, in the specific interval her father had described to her when she was 4 years old as the quietest moment a person can find. She fired. The shot crossed the range. On the observation platform, heads turned. Greer said something into his microphone. Board members moved back from the table with the instinctive response of people who have heard a shot fired outside the expected parameters of a controlled environment. Patterson moved back from the table edge. In the northeastern corner, the figure in maintenance coveralls dropped. The range safety alarm activated 6 seconds later, filling the complex with the sustained tone that means all activity ceases and the range safety officer assumes control. She heard running feet, radio traffic crackling from multiple positions. From the platform above, voices finding their registers in the rising volume of people who have just understood that something real has happened. She cleared the rifle. She placed it on the bench. She stood and put her hands at shoulder height in the visible position, because armed personnel were going to arrive in the next 30 seconds, and the first 3 seconds of that encounter needed to go in a specific direction. Hollis reached her first. He looked at her. He looked at the northeastern corner. He looked at the rifle. He picked up the rifle case and began packing it. She said, "Patterson." He said, "Fine. Moving to the secure area now." She said, "The intercept team." He said, "They found a secondary position 30 seconds after your shot. This wasn't a solo operation. The backup element is in custody." She looked at the observation platform. Stokes was still seated at the far left end of the table, slightly apart from the others, slightly back, hands flat in front of him, exactly as he had sat at the beginning of all this. He was looking directly at her across the length of the range. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she walked toward the platform steps. She found him at the back of the platform, in the corner where the railing met the wall. After the board members had been escorted to the administrative building, and the range safety personnel had taken control, and the sounds of the situation resolving itself were still moving through the facility like the aftershock of something that has passed its peak. He looked older than he had looked this morning. Not dramatically, just the way a man looks when something he has been carrying for a very long time has finally arrived at its destination, and he no longer has any reason to hold it in the particular way he has been holding it. He said, "You read the file?" She said, "Every page." He said, "I know you went into my office. I've known since 02:15 Wednesday. I had a contact sensor on the safe housing. Old habit. It logged the access." She said, "You didn't do anything about it?" He said, "No." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who is no longer performing anything. He said, "I need you to understand something. Not for my benefit, not for my record or my legacy or anything that concerns me, because you deserve to understand what actually happened to your father, what I did, and why I did it, and what it has cost me to have done it." She said, "Then tell me." He told her. He had been a captain in 2003. The directive that originated the secondary target in Kunar province had not come to him as an order. It had come as a request from a man whose name sat above his in a chain that operated parallel to standard command structure. A chain that existed to give certain people certain capabilities without the documentary trail that official channels require. He had been told the target was a hostile facilitator. He had signed because he believed what he was told, and because the man doing the asking had the kind of authority that turns questions into insubordination. He found out the truth 4 days after Frank Voss died. He said, "I tried to have the record corrected. I prepared a report. I went to the JAG office. I was told, in language that was very precise and very clear, that if I pursued this, the 11 men on that package with your father would face courts-martial for the unauthorized movement that got him killed. The record would be constructed to make them responsible. 11 careers, 11 families." He said, "I made a decision. I have lived inside that decision every day for 21 years. The range was quiet around them. She said, "The man who gave you the directive," he said, "his name is Harlan Croft. He retired from government service in 2009 with full honors and a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. He is 73 years old and lives in McLean, Virginia, and currently advises 3 defense contracting firms whose names you would recognize immediately." She said, "And today?" He said, "Croft has known since last month that this assessment program existed. He has known since 2 weeks ago that you were in it. He understood what that meant, what you would find, what you would do with it. He is a man who has spent his career solving problems before they become unmanageable. Today was him attempting to solve one. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He said, "I have been waiting for the right person to give this to for a long time. I considered the press, the inspector general, a dozen different channels over 21 years. I dismissed each one because I didn't trust any of them to hold the weight of it without it being managed and minimized and buried the way inconvenient things get buried when they threaten the right people." He held the paper out. He said, "This is everything. Every name, every date, every communication I retained. The parallel chain, the people in it, the specific records that contradict the official account of your father's death. I have been carrying it since 2003. She took the paper. She said, "Why me?" He said, "Because you came here without asking permission and without asking for help, and you didn't make it about anything except finding out what was true. Because you sat in that chair today and shot 30 out of 30 after 5 days of Hell Week, and then turned around and took a reversed wind shot across the range at 340 yards without a moment's hesitation." He paused. He said, "Because your father would have done exactly what you did, in exactly the order you did it, for exactly the same reasons. I watched you for 9 days, Miss Voss. I was watching for reasons that were not generous, but I watched." She held the paper in her hands. After a moment, she said, "The 11 men, the ones you protected." He said, "All living, most retired, 2 still serving." She said, "They should know why." He said, "Yes, they should." She folded the paper and put it in her pocket alongside the dog tag, alongside everything her father had left her that fit inside the dimensions of a person. She said, "I'll be in touch, Admiral." She walked down the steps. The board convened 3 days later in a room in the administrative complex that had no windows and very good acoustics, and the specific atmosphere of a space where consequential decisions are made by people who have thought carefully about how to make them. 7 chairs on one side of a long table, 1 chair on the other side. The chair on the other side had a card taped to the back of it. The card said, "Voss," in block letters, written in the neat, unhurried handwriting of someone who had taken the time to do it properly. She noticed the handwriting. She noticed the care in it. Master Chief Dale Harp was standing against the wall to the left of the door, not seated at the table, not part of the formal board, present in the capacity of a man who wanted to be here for something, without being asked and without asking permission, which was entirely consistent with everything she had come to understand about him. When she came through the door, he looked at her. Not the look from the first morning, the flat professional assessment of someone measuring a gap between what they are seeing and what they consider possible. A different look, the look of a man who has spent 30 years evaluating people and has arrived, with genuine rarity, at a conclusion he was not expecting when he began. He nodded once. She nodded back. She sat down in the chair with her name on it. The senior board member, the flag officer from Naval Special Warfare Command, opened a folder and looked at her and said, "Miss Voss, this board has reviewed the results of the BUD/S pilot assessment program in full. Your performance scores, instructor evaluations, peer observations, and the additional documentation submitted regarding the events of the assessment's final day. We have also been briefed, in summary, on certain other matters being addressed through appropriate channels." He said, "It is the recommendation of this board that you be designated as a qualified candidate for advanced special operations integration, and that the door opened by this assessment remain open, formally and permanently, for future candidates who meet the standard you have demonstrated." He said, "The chair at this table is yours, if you choose to accept it." She looked at the 7 faces across the table. She looked at Harp against the wall, who was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has finished something difficult and found that the feeling on the other side of it is simpler and quieter than he had expected it to be. She put her hand in her pocket and found the dog tag and held it without taking it out. She thought about a cabin in Montana and a trigger set at 2 pounds 2 ounces and a photograph of a man with a smile that hadn't decided and a small girl with serious eyes. She thought about a list of 12 names written in handwriting that leaned slightly right. She thought about Navy hymn moving through cold air on a dark beach. 5 imperfect voices making something that mattered anyway. She thought about a safe that opened in 90 seconds because someone had put her small hands on the dial when she was 7 years old and taught her to listen. She sat forward in the chair. She said, "I accept." 3 weeks later, Montana was moving into the hard edge of November, the kind of cold that stops being seasonal and starts being structural, the bones of winter showing through the thinning skin of autumn. The lake was the color of slate. The tree line had given up most of its color. The mornings came later and stayed gray longer, and the air carried the smell of snow that hadn't arrived yet, but was making its intentions clear. Riley ran 8 miles before dawn. The pace was different, not faster, not harder, different in some quality she could feel in her feet as they found the frozen ground and left it, in her arms, in her lungs, in the rhythm that moved through her, the way the hymn had moved through that cold beach. Not as preparation for something else, not as performance, as a thing complete in itself, belonging to no purpose other than the fact of it. She ran the ridge in the back slope in the eastern edge of the lake and came home. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched the lake in the thin, pale light that was as much as November morning offered. And it was enough. She went to the photograph on the wall, the man with the smile, the small girl with the serious eyes. 2002, before everything. She took her father's dog tag from her pocket and reached up and hung it on the corner of the frame, where it rested against the photograph's edge, the stamped letters catching what light there was. Voss, Frank A. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the table and opened the notebook she had started the night she returned from Coronado and found a blank page and picked up the pen. The notebook was for the 11 men, the ones who had gone into the Kunar province in March 2003 and come back without their team chief and spent 21 years without knowing the full dimensions of why. She was writing down what she knew in the order she knew it, so that when she found them, one by one, starting with the first name on her father's list, they would have the complete picture. Not a fragment of it, not the official version. The true version, the one their team chief had tried to create the record for before the record was taken from him. She would call Whitaker before she was done. Not today. Today the notebook was the only conversation that mattered. But she would call him, and when she did, she would tell him, "It's done. The door is open. You can put it down now." She was 3 pages in when she stopped and looked up. The lake was a different color than it had been when she sat down. The day had committed to being what it was going to be. The dog tag caught the window light and held it. She looked at the photograph. She said quietly to the man with the smile and the small girl with the serious eyes, "I found them, Pop." She picked up the pen. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and moved through the tree line and crossed the surface of the lake and went on, moving from one place to the next with the patient continuity of something that has a long way to go and made its decision about getting there long before this particular morning. Frank Voss had gone into a province in the dark on March 17th, 2003, and he had not come back. He had gone because the men with him needed someone to go, and because he was the kind of man who, when the situation required it, was simply there. Not heroically, not for the record, in the plain, essential way that certain people show up for others when the cost of showing up is everything they have. He had not gotten to finish what he started. His daughter was finishing it. She wrote for another hour in the stillness of the cabin, the pen moving across the page in handwriting that leaned slightly right. And the light changed around her and the lake shifted color, and the day moved forward the way days do. Not waiting, not asking permission, just moving. She put the pen down. She looked at the photograph one more time. She looked at the dog tag. Then she turned the page and kept going.